is Monica Perez, and welcome to our first episode of our reading and discussion of the book Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas P. Neill, PhD. So, the last series of books were Jim Keith. It was Mass Control about Mind Control. It was The Octopus, the story of Danny Casolaro. And I wanted to do something that was a little more academic, a little more down the line mainstream, and give you the facts from an intellectual's, an intellectual academic researcher's point of view, and see if you understand how we got here. And I would say you can go down rabbit holes for each of the people in this book. Some of the actual items in the book dangle those threads. And I do want to say that when I read these books, I've read them before. I wouldn't read a book to you that I haven't read before, screened thoroughly, but it's always been a while. So it's been years since I've read this book, and I will enjoy the wonderment of of rediscovering some of the little tidbits in here. And of course, I do not agree with the stuff that I read. I have no idea if I'm going to agree or disagree with this stuff. I'll probably let you know as we go along. And I hope that you enjoy it. Okay. Makers of the Modern Mind. Thomas P. Neill was a professor of history at St. Louis University. And let's see. Preface to the second edition, which is what this is. The first edition of this book appeared in 1949. According to the criteria used for selecting the 11 men treated in that edition, it seemed that John Dewey should have been included as a maker of the modern mind. So let me just rattle off the people who are in the book. Calvin, Rousseau, Freud, Bentham, Newton, Locke, Darwin, Kant, Luther, Dewey, Descartes, and Marx. But Dewey was still alive and in his 90th year, actively publishing and influencing contemporary thought. For that reason, he was not included. Since he died in 1952 and his direct contribution has been made, there seems no reason for not including him in the present edition. For on the basis of his influence on the way men think today, John Dewey ranks as a major maker of the modern mind. The reader has a right to know both what this book does not pretend to be and what it is meant to be. It is not a history of Western thought. It is not an attempt to account fully and completely for how men in Western civilization think today. In other words, it is not a full account of the making of the modern mind. If such an essay were attempted, it would have to examine the contribution of a host of persons not included in the following pages. Men like Francis Bacon, of course, Voltaire, the encyclopedists, Galileo, Leibniz, Fichte, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and many others. It would also have to dwell on certain non-intellectual or non-theoretical developments which have done much to condition and direct modern thought. These are such developments as the scientific movement, the industrial and technological revolutions, the rejection of older Christian criteria and values in favor of naturalistic goals and standards. So I want to mention that because this book was written in 1949 and then here revised in 1958, I believe is this edition. For me, it was since that time that that we've become really manipulated. The way we think, academia, politics, the media, the three things that have the most influence on us and have no accountability. There's no rubber hitting the road. It's not a retail outlet. You could be wrong forever. Or you can have ulterior motives forever. I feel like over the years, the JFK assassination was one marker in this. 9/11 was marker where the world of ideas, thoughts, information has become more and more controlled, and their ability to control how we think, mass control, mind control, basically, is, so I wouldn't take at face value, oh, the Industrial Revolution changed how people think. It did. And it probably did so genuinely. Whereas like the birth control changed how people think. But I think it was meant to. I think it was put there in order to do that. So, or let's say the dangers of it were um, not expressed because for ulterior motives. But so I think an older book like this, while maybe a little bit dated, maybe not, is a little more reliable. A thorough account of how the modern mind has developed would obviously be the work of a lifetime and would be published in many volumes. The author believes that a single volume can sketch out the main lines of this development for those who are interested in the subject but cannot make it a lifetime study. Reaction to the first edition of this book has suggested that its arrangement was satisfactorily devised for most readers. The plan was to weave together studies of the thought and influence of the most important makers of the modern mind so that they could serve as mileposts to show the reader where Western thought stood at significant moments in history. Certain criteria were used in selecting our original 11 makers of the modern mind and in adding Dewey to their number. First of all, they were not chosen for the intrinsic worth of their thought. There are many sounder thinkers through modern history than the men treated in this volume, but their influence was restricted to relatively small groups or areas, and though their contributions to our thinking are not negligible, they are nevertheless relatively unimportant. Now, that I would say is by design. That's what I'm saying. Nor was originality a criterion for selecting our makers of the modern mind. Truly original thinkers are seldom immediately influential. They are usually quite obscure, pioneers, as it were, who open up new avenues of thought that later thinkers develop and make popular intellectual highways. The men treated in these pages were selected primarily on the criterion of influence. A second criterion, which usually overlaps the first and is sometimes practically identical with it, is their being representative of their age. In the first edition of this book, we summed up our reasons for making the choices we did in this way. The men treated here are chosen, then, not for the intrinsic worth of their thought, but for their importance in making the Western mind what it is today. There are other more profound and other more original thinkers, but there are none more influential on subsequent generations and consequently directly or indirectly on this one. Our 11 makers of the modern mind were almost always influential, as we shall see, because they said what the world wanted to hear at the time they spoke. They were sometimes influential, as Locke and Darwin were, precisely because they were not profound thinkers. Yet because they struck up sympathetic vibrations with their own or with succeeding generations, they are important. For this reason, they merit serious attention by those who would see how the modern mind has grown in order to understand how it functions as it does today. I personally feel like the reason some things are more influential, it's just like on your Twitter feed or whatever, or in your search engine. Some stuff is put up at the top and for reasons. And I think they get into that with Darwin in this, either directly or you can just say, hey man, obviously this is why they promoted him. Picking a dozen makers of the modern mind is something like picking an all-American football team. No two persons will have the same 12 men. The dozen thinkers in this book would be included on most lists, but one or more would be replaced on different lists by such men as Hegel, Bacon, William James, and Leibniz. In each case, we feel the inclusion of our thinkers can be justified and the omissions explained. Hegel is as important as the men included in this volume, for example, but he is omitted because his dialect is explained with Marx and his idealism is at least briefly described with Dewey. A separate chapter on him would therefore involve repetition. Similarly, William James is not given a chapter because his thought is adverted to sufficiently in the chapter on Dewey. Although no one would pick exactly the same 12 as this author has, nevertheless, he hopes that the reader will understand, first, that there is reason behind each choice and each omission, and second, that no pretense is made that the 12 men here treated are solely responsible for the making of the modern mind. All right. Here's the intro. Introduction. 7 men on an elephant. The dizzy pace at which the world has progressed in all branches of applied learning this past century has given rise to a disturbing paradox. Never before in history have men known so much about so many things, and never have they been so confused on such basic questions as whether the world is what it seems or even whether they have minds. As scholars probe more deeply into the secrets of nature and encompass ever wider fields of knowledge, they find it necessary to specialize more and more exclusively on smaller and smaller areas of knowledge. Thus, collectively, they have pushed back the frontiers of knowledge and multiplied many times over the sum of facts known by mankind. But in the process, each specialist has necessarily closed his mind to everything except his own little specialty. He lets the rest of the world go by. 200 years ago, for example, the average physician did not have too profound a knowledge of medicine, but he understood other aspects of life well enough to act as friend and counselor to his patients on 100 various problems. A century ago, doctors tended to see all human problems in terms of physiological upsets because they had learned more about medicine and closed their minds to the intricacies of agriculture, finance, and human relationships. Today, as the result of increased specialization, the heart specialist tends to see every human disorder in terms of cardiac disturbances, and the psychiatrist sees the same illnesses in terms of neurosis. In days gone by, to take another example, the competent historian knew the general story of man's past fairly well. Today, no historian is considered respectable unless he has specialized in the events of a single decade within a single country. About the rest of history, he may be as ignorant as the physician or the lawyer. So it necessarily is, of course, in all branches of learning, because there are only 24 hours in the day and about 20,000 days in a lifetime. I never thought of it that way. Such specialization as we have in the modern world can be accomplished only by sacrificing wide knowledge for deep learning in a tiny area. Modern scholars, therefore, remind one of that little jingle most of us learned as children. It was 6 men of Indostan who learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. Each man, the fable runs, took hold of the elephant at a different place, and each concluded from his limited experience what sort of animal this wondrous elephant was. One bumped against its side, so he decided that the elephant is very like a wall. Another took hold of its tusk and therefore concluded that it was very like a spear. A third thought the elephant was similar to a snake because he had grabbed its squirming trunk. A fourth, who clasped it by the knee, thought it very like a tree. Another felt its ear and thought it was like a fan. And the sixth blind man, grabbing its tail, concluded it was very like a rope. And so the men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. The two important points behind this little jingle are obvious. In the first place, the 6 men of Indostan argued loud and long about an animal none of them had ever seen. Each had, so to speak, become a specialist on one part of the elephant's anatomy. Each was, therefore, competent to talk about his specialty, but none was qualified to generalize correctly about the elephant as an animal. Each was therefore partly right, but all were wrong, because none of the men could step back a few paces to see the whole elephant. The 6 fields of specialization created confusion about the animal as a whole. But there is still a 7th man, so horrified at the findings of the blind men and their acrimonious debate that he is content to see the elephant from a distance. His vision remains intact, but he learns little that is exact about the elephant. Closer inspection of the contemporary mind reveals how men today are faced with the dilemma of the 7 men on the elephant, of giving up specialization to preserve sanity, or giving up a rounded knowledge of things human to learn ever more about smaller areas of knowledge. He's writing this 75 years ago. For closer inspection reveals how striking is the paradox between the modern mind's wonderful accomplishments and its awful shortcomings. Freedom of controversy and tolerance of almost any opinion are accorded to all people, at least in this country. This is a possession which we of the modern world are likely to take for granted without reflecting how it was won by bitter struggle through the long years of modern history. It is a priceless heritage through which man can arrive at truth more surely and more readily than in any other way. Modern humanitarianism again compares favorably with the way man has dealt with man anytime in the past. It is good to try rehabilitating criminals instead of torturing them. It is good to assure medical services, education, old age assistance, and unemployment relief to the less fortunate members of the human race. Are we already going to have to argue politics? It's good to have those things, but I think they're different. I'm not sure you can trust the government to do it. Ugh. It is good, moreover, not to abandon the alleviation of suffering to the chance offerings of private charity alone. It is good to hate dictatorship for its demoralizing attack on human persons, and it is good to prize democracy for the dignity and worth it accords a man simply because he is a human being. These are all good things, and they are all the fruit of long, hard struggles in the past. I'm wondering if he's like just going to end it there because uh, I'm not sure I agree with him completely. All right. I definitely don't think that those should be the assurances of the state. I assume he's saying this is the state. Anyway, all right. We're just going to have to deal with this. It's not my book. Man's recent accomplishments in the fields of science and medicine are wonderful. His lifespan has been lengthened many years and it has been made more comfortable than ever before. The utilization of water power, of electricity, and now of atomic energy are in themselves all good things, for they are victories for man in his struggle to subdue the forces of nature and to use them for his welfare. I will allow semi-collegiate to interject. A strong economy solves most of the problems he speaks of. And I would say a truly free economy would solve all of those problems as a result of all of these advancements. We would have such abundance that the powers that be would not have to go out of their way to keep them away from us, as per the report from Iron Mountain, which was written after this. Most occulted, semi-collegiate adds, is real economics. True. Even man's study of himself has revealed much that was undreamed of in the past. It is good to know how the mind of man works, how his decisions are made, how unconscious drives affect conscious activity. Man's self analysis and self criticism have developed tremendously in the past century, and this development has opened up amazing possibilities for social control and for individual betterment in the future. All these things, it must be remembered, have been accomplished because of specialization. These findings of the specialist are good, but few of them have been as fully utilized as possible because men lack the wisdom and the self control to use them to the best advantage. To cite a currently overworked example, atomic energy is potentially man's greatest servant, but at the same time, it can be employed to destroy millions of human beings. So it is with every other modern accomplishment. Television is potentially a means of contributing to the education, the culture, and the pleasure of the human race. But it is also potentially a means of stirring up hatred among men or rousing them to blind fury and to animal like action. The press can be used to make the public a well informed citizenry in every country in the world. But at the same time, it can misinform and beguile its readers and hide from them the truth they have the right to know. Forces created by the specialist are always potentially good or bad, depending on the wisdom shown in employing them. But unfortunately, in the process of specialization, we have sacrificed wisdom for learning. We have indeed tended to dehumanize ourselves and to lose the rational self possession that characterized educated persons in days gone by. I think we're getting back on track with this guy. For paradoxically, insanity increases as man learns more about the world. Neurotics multiply as man learns more about himself. Confusion closes in on his mind as it obtains a clearer picture of atomic fission or of the action of antibodies in the bloodstream. Never before in history, in fact, have there been so many people suffering from mental disorders as there are today. 8 to 10 million in this country alone, according to the best estimates made in recent years. That's probably 10% of the population. Millions appear back then. Millions appear more interested in their own minds than in anything else. And though introspection has helped us discover much about ourselves, in its general effect, it appears corrosive instead of salutary. It seems to have caused more neurosis than it has cured. So it has been with other developments in human thought. Each appears paradoxically to walk arm in arm with its own negation. At the same time that humanitarianism has won the modern mind, humanitarians are discovered holding an extremely low opinion of man. See, that's what I was taught was like the problem with secular humanism. You're kind of doing it for man, and man kind of doesn't deserve it. So, like Mother Teresa used to say, she listed like if you have a sick person, visit them, whatever. If you have a drunk person, listen to him. And I'm like, you can't do that for him. You do it for the love of God or for some higher purpose. So I believe that the humanitarians are the ones who think most ill. Maybe they see more clearly. I don't know. Maybe that's why they think something needs to be done. The English Canine Defense League, for example, requested President Truman to save animals by using convicted war criminals in the Bikini Atom bomb tests. Oh my gosh. Protesting against the use of innocent animals for this purpose. It requested the president to substitute subhumans in the shape of humans in their place. Somebody look up the English Canine Defense League, please. I have a feeling that if you find their founders, they're going to be highly political. There are almost daily press reports of dogs and cats receiving large bequests from persons unmoved by the human poverty in their neighborhoods or of people opposed to sending relief to children in impoverished lands, but enthusiastic about feeding undernourished kittens at home. My parents objected to pets and art for that reason. There are people starving. Sincere thinkers are concerned about this paradoxical situation of the modern mind in doing so much for concrete, practical science, and yet remaining so confused on many of the basic problems of human existence. They therefore try to resolve it in either of two ways. If specialists, they may tend to concentrate ever more fiercely on the elephant's tail or trunk or whatever their specialty may be, trying to convince themselves that this is the one thing of most importance, while ignoring the rest of the world or viewing it largely in the narrow terms of their own specialty. The other alternative is simply to stay aloof entirely from this paradox of the modern mind and to deny at the same time the validity of the specialist's observation. Neither of these two classes can be right. If the fable of the 6 men and the elephant is to have a happy ending, we need still another man, an eighth, to stand back a few paces, study the elephant as an integral whole, find out what the blind specialists are doing, and then correlate their findings into a unified picture. This eighth man, then, must be one who welcomes sincerely the genuine discoveries of any specialist, but who never loses sight of the whole animal that is being studied piecemeal by the 6 blind men. It would therefore be well to draw back historically from this elephant problem to see how it came to be the confusing thing it is today. Such was always the advice of Aristotle, who said more than 20 centuries ago, "He who considers things in their growth and origin will obtain the clearest view of them." As contemporary a philosopher as Santayana wrote in the same vein not so many years ago, that a grasp of tradition is a great advantage, conducive to mutual understanding, to maturity, and to progress. Seeing these problems grow would, of course, that's exactly what the controllers of academics, politics, the media are separating us from now. That the past, the generations, and the information, and the heirloom wisdom. Seeing these problems grow would at least reveal to us that what we consider peculiar shortcomings in the modern mind, as well as its various strong points, are not nearly so novel as they seem to us today. We would see, for example, how men have never been moved by pure reason alone, how they have always been emotional as well as rational beings, how prejudice and various kinds of pressure groups have always forced decisions in one direction or another. We would see how toleration of others' views grew slowly and was brought out not only by much bloodshed, but also by, unfortunately, developing a kind of intellectual indifferentism, which is inimical to clearly defined thinking. We would see how the difficult balance between the head and the heart has been tipped historically, now in favor of the head, now of the heart. How one extreme almost always begets the other within a relatively short time. Such a story, however, would be too full and too complicated for the compass of a single volume. But by following the intellectual development of certain foremost makers of the modern mind, we may hope to throw light on the paradox which contemporary man creates by solving intricate intellectual problems while denying that he even has a mind. Good point. The 12 men selected for treatment in the following pages serve a double role in helping us to understand the modern mind. Excuse me. The 12 men selected for treatment in the following pages serve a double role. In the first place, their contributions to the fund of human knowledge bulk large. They are the master builders in making the modern mind, and though there are hundreds of other thinkers who made their individual contributions to the history of ideas, nevertheless, the thought of these men added together comes close to giving an accurate and complete picture of what is here called the modern mind. In the second place, the 12 men treated in these pages serve handily as pegs on which to hang a number of pertinent truths in the development of modern thought, for they exemplify intellectual currents of their age. Change in intellectual climate, of course, is gradual, and it is affected as much by a concatenation of economic, social, political, and human causes as it is by the mighty mind of an individual thinker. The makers of the modern mind selected for treatment here therefore serve the secondary purpose of being milestones in the Western world's intellectual history these past 4 centuries. The road goes on between them without sharp turns. They show us from time to time whither the road is leading. That's why I think this is a valuable and worthwhile book, even though it's 75 years old, because I would think the newer stuff would tend to be overweighted because it seems so obvious now, but this information doesn't expire. It might be good to see it from a perspective other than our immediate. Yep, we've got a few comments. I'm going to read the comments before I start the first chapter. Hobbes says there should be a remakers of the modern mind. Pavlov, Bernays, Cialdini might play an important role. Neill Postman once wrote about how our attention spans have been gradually shortened from Sesame Street to network news, like our brains are being restructured, maybe. And also mentions that the great Harry Brown was a cryptographer for the Army, witnessed some of the Bikini Bottom tests. Yeah, that's why SpongeBob can talk, I think. Isn't that like the underlying premise there? Doesn't it open with an atom bomb? Okay. Without further ado, let us go to Luther, the priesthood of all believers. Martin Luther is very much a modern man. Where Calvin would look coldly on the modern world and pierce its confused hubbub with his icy eye, Luther would enter into the confusion with gusto. Where Descartes would retire to his ivory tower to shut out noisy men and withdraw into the world of his own thought, Luther would descend into the marketplace and the tavern, rub elbows with laborers and shopkeepers, argue with amateur politicians, and appear on quiz programs. Where Karl Marx would look for the universal world scheme behind the day's iniquity, Luther would declaim against the price of wheat and the quality of men's shirts, and he would discover an easy formula as a means of fixing irreparable guilt on the heads of his enemies. The ex-Augustinian monk can easily be imagined at home as a leader in the contemporary world. He would fit in nicely as a labor chief or a self-made industrialist, as a senator or the big man in the local Rotary Club. He would be a restless but effective figure in the modern world, one continually in the headlines, one always getting things done. He would be sharply criticized by some, but he would be a hero to his followers. He would be a rough and tumble figure in public life, and he would love it. He would revel in the confusion and the scurry of the modern nuclear world, except when it grew very dark and a little quiet. Then he would be afraid. Luther would be a successful figure today, for he possessed qualities of leadership and of dynamic forcefulness that make for success in a disjointed world. He was important, in fact, precisely because his age was out of joint and out of temper. Europeans felt the need of leadership early in the 16th century when the medieval world was disappearing and the dim outlines of the modern world were yet but vaguely seen. Leadership fell to Martin Luther, a German who knew the German people, their hopes as well as their hates, who felt as they felt and spoke their rough Germanic tongue. Luther was truly volkstümlich, sprung from the people, and he never let the people forget it. He achieved historical importance because he expressed certain powerful but suppressed feelings of the German people, because he appealed to the cupidity of the nobles and the ambition of the princes, because the time was ripe for such a revolution as his, and he instinctively knew how to utilize the forces of change at his disposal. Of Luther's importance, there is no question. His was the first permanent break from the Roman Catholic Church. His was a religion which stressed blind trust and deprecated philosophy, a homocentric religion which was much more in tune with the succeeding individualist ages than was the Catholic religion from which it broke. Luther's attack on reason, his obviously homocentric means man-centered. Okay. Luther's attack on reason, his insistence that every man could be his own priest and prophet, his outlook on man as an essentially depraved creature, were all to bear their bitter fruit in later, more auspicious days. More immediately, Luther justified and promoted the ambitions of the prince. He furthered religious divisions along national lines and thus helped usher into European history the truly bloody religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. This is going to be a good book, I think, and I seem to recall, because that's the kind of stuff that people don't realize, that Luther nailed the thing on the wall. But then there were these wars of the Reformation, and the princes took over the lands of the Catholic Church. And I mean, who knows why this guy's story bubbled up to the surface? What prince wouldn't want to promote him? Had Luther never lived, it is true, there would likely have arisen another figure who would have led such a movement as his. But there was a Luther, and the fact remains that it was he who initiated the break, who gave it the direction and tone it possessed. Luther did not control the movement, however, after it got underway. The princes did that. Nor did he formulate final Lutheran doctrine. The Augsburg Confession of 1530, the basis of Lutheran doctrine, is more Melanchthon's work than Luther's. But Luther remained the leader and the public relations man of the movement throughout his lifetime, and his influence on European mentality is decisive. His famous, I'm not sure I'm up to pronouncing this Latin, Pecca fortiter et crede firmius. I know my priest listener is going to tell me how to pronounce that. Sin boldly and believe more firmly. That's it in English. Sin boldly and believe more firmly. Wow. As well as his insistence that each man is his own priest and prophet, was rejected by princes and by later Lutherans. But as Jacques Maritain puts it, the spirit of Luther went on traveling underground for new upheavals and new crises. In justice to Luther and to later Lutherans, therefore, we must distinguish Luther's teaching from its results. Like every founder of a school in modern times, Luther deplored the conclusions to which his theories were reduced in his own lifetime. He would indeed have thundered out a century later, "If this is Lutheranism, I am no Lutheran." The results to which Luther's theories were reduced were in some respects better and in others worse than his own teaching. Certainly, the Lutheranism of Melanchthon was not what Luther envisaged when he first propounded his doctrine after breaking from Rome. But we are more interested in the results of his teaching than in the teaching itself. We must see what happened to the modern mind because of Luther's theories. But we must not assume that he either foresaw or desired those results. Luther could have made his mark only... Okay, so this is section one. I guess that was an intro to Luther. These things, I'm aiming for 2 episodes per person. So it's probably like going to be 2 hours for each thing. We'll see by the end of today if we get further or less far. But anyway, that was a little intro. to the Luther chapter. This is part 1. Luther could have made his mark only when society was in flux, as it is today, when there was discontent deep in men's hearts, when the existing powers abused their trust. He could have come to the fore only in a world where things were changing, where there were rumblings beneath the surface of society, where men's minds were not at rest, and where their hearts were not at peace. Luther lived in such a society. The scholastic philosophy, which had reached a high point in the 13th century and had guided the thought of most educated Europeans at that time, had come upon sorry days. There had developed many varieties of scholasticism, and their rivalry was intense, as rivalry so frequently becomes in philosophy and theology. By the time Luther was ready for school, in the Occamist variety of scholasticism had triumphed in most places. By the time Luther was ready for school, the Occamist variety of scholasticism had triumphed in most places. Aristotle was still supposed to be the philosopher, but it was a caricature of Aristotle that the Occamists passed out to their students. The validity of abstraction, a key point with Aristotle and the scholastics, had been denied by the Occamists, who propounded nominalism instead. Is this like Occam's razor? I didn't know there was more to it than that. The theory that there is no reality except concrete reality, that such terms as man and good are only labels or names attached for the sake of convenience to certain concrete things in order to group them under various handy headings. Philosophy was thus becoming a science of semantics, of terminism. Men naturally reacted to such a system of thought. Either they tended to become skeptics, insisting we can have sure knowledge of nothing, or they threw the whole business of philosophy overboard and insisted on good living instead of good thinking. They asked with Thomas à Kempis, what signifies making a great dispute about hidden things, which for having been ignorant of, we shall not be reproved in the judgment? And they answered nothing. So let me do that again, because Thomas à Kempis wrote The Imitation of Christ, and some have said, like, if there's one thing that you should like read and get, it's pretty slim. That's a good one. I think I've attempted that one a couple of times and never finished it. Maybe it's too hard to do. So let's just read this again. They asked, like Thomas à Kempis asked, what signifies making a great dispute about hidden things, which for having been ignorant of, we shall not be reproved in the judgment? So like, why bother knowing? And they said, yeah, don't worry about it. My guess is Thomas à Kempis would tell you, you have to because you want to be closer to Christ or whatever. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I don't think you're allowed to do that. I think you have kind of an imperative. Like, I think you're supposed to, from those to whom much has been given, much will be expected. That's my answer to that. Europe was cracking up prior to Luther's coming on the scene, not only intellectually, but also religiously. The authority of the Catholic Church, the governess of the universities, and the mistress of truth in medieval days had been badly shaken by a long series of events in the 14th and 15th centuries. First had come the quarrel with the newly founded national monarchies over the taxation of the clergy. The last great medieval pope, Boniface VIII, had hurled a defiance at Philip IV of France and Edward I of England. Edward I of England, that was in the early days. Y'all see The Last Kingdom? That was like 1,000 years ago. Neither king gave way. Neither did Boniface, who died shortly after being manhandled by Philip's envoys sent to Agnagne to arrest him. But his successors found it convenient to back down before the kings. Then came the popes, lowercase p, plural, all the popeses, if you're from New York, long Babylonian captivity at Avignon, where they appeared to be under French control through a large part of the 100 Years' War, surrounded as nominally sovereign Avignon was by French territory. In this age of developing national feeling, popes were condemned by the French for not being sufficiently French, and by Englishmen, Germans, and Italians for being too French. In 1377, the Pope returned to Rome, and in the next year began the worst divisive force of all for the Catholic Church, the Great Western Schism. There came to be two claimants to the papacy, two rival colleges of cardinals, two appointees for each vacant bishopric, two obediences, and two Peter's Pence collections to support the two rival popes. This internal struggle within the church lowered the papacy in the eyes of the faithful throughout Europe. And all Europeans were Catholic then, to the level of a kingly crown about which rival dynasties warred. When the schism was ended and unity was established in the Catholic Church again, the Pope found that he could not effect reforms he saw were necessary. Any talk of reform in the high places of the church, where it was most severely needed, provoked talk of another schism, and the reform proposal was quietly dropped. The church never recovered the prestige lost through the long Babylonian captivity, which was from 1305 to 1377, and the Great Western Schism, which was from 1378 to 1415. For new attitudes had been in the making in these years. A new worldliness had developed. A new skepticism had crept into men's minds. A new standard of morality and a new hierarchy of values had been formulated. The Renaissance had come to Europe and had taken hold of the best educated men of the time, laymen and churchmen alike. As an aside, I always wondered if the Industrial Revolution and the scientific advancements and even the Enlightenment were a function of the competition between the church and the state, or the church and the various states, as opposed to China, where they should have made those advancements. And I think they did, but they were suppressed because there was a unified goal at the top to keep the hierarchy in place, and the individual himself would not have been empowered the same way you would be when your loyalty was being competed for. You can demand more when there's competition. I mean, maybe it'll pan out as we read this book. I don't know, but that was just always a question I had. Men of the Renaissance had thrown off the tutelage of the church and the protection of the nobility. They had decided to think as they wished and to protect themselves as they could. They lowered their gaze from the clouds to the earth at their feet, and they discovered many things. They quit looking for pie in the sky, and they found in their midst something that has passed for pie from that day till this. They concentrated on themselves and created for themselves an anthropocentric morality and an individualistic society to replace the theocentric world of medieval times. They let those who liked that sort of thing contemplate playing a harp forever on the edge of a wet cloud, but they tried to achieve immortality in the memory of man. They decided to go ahead down here below and not think too much about what might happen after they died. Worldly success became self-justifying. Restraints were cast off, sometimes openly denied, and sometimes just conveniently forgotten. The Renaissance was an age of rugged individualism for artists, businessmen, and princes alike. The strongest survived and were held up by mothers and schoolmasters as models for children of the next generation. Funny little thing there about thinking about immortality and the memory of man. If my father ever saw a building named after a person, like the whatever Trump wing of a hospital, which, by the way, did not exist before he ran for president, because he really wasn't like that. Under normal circumstances, they say that person craves immortality, but doesn't have the faith for it. So it has to leave his mark here. I just thought that was interesting. Men of the Renaissance looked for a new moral code that would justify this restless, ruthless sort of life. And they found it in the humanities of the classical past. So there was a revival of classical Greek and Roman culture, which had never been blacked out completely, and the ancients soon became models not only for style, but also for standards of conduct. The murder of Caesar, for example, was repeated with monotonous regularity almost whenever a reasonable duplicate of the stalwart old Roman could be found by a group of young men anxious to live forever in the memory of posterity. Life became laxer and freer, especially among those who drank deep of the wine of antiquity. And among these were, in high proportion, the higher clergy of the church. Yes, I think I know where this is going. This return to frankly pagan living was most ostentatiously accomplished in Italy. No, I think what I'm thinking also is that there may have been a transformation. I don't think they covered here, like a transition kind of from the Platonic communal, take all the boys from all the families and the best one rises to the top philosopher king kind of thing of the medieval church that spanned Europe. And I don't know if there was a transition or what, but that's very different from the kind of Aristotelian individualistic stuff that came in the church later. But I am no scholar on that stuff. I find these little observations like more accessible because they just seem obvious. And you can have opinions about it from looking. This return to frankly pagan living was most ostentatiously accomplished in Italy, the most cultured part of the European world. In the German countries, the old scholasticism had degenerated into nominalism and terminism in the schools and into a frank rejection of reason among many learned, pious people. But along with rational thought, they also rejected pagan morals. Instead, they developed a mysticism, especially in the Low Countries, which gave them a direct wire to heaven, to truth, and to morality without plugging in through the switchboard of reason. They were ready, before Luther was in school, to attack both the loose living and the speculative thought of Rome. They had their weapons of a false mysticism and a false asceticism. They only needed someone to wield them effectively. The days of Luther's youth were days of unrest socially and politically. In Western Europe, Italy, Spain, France, and England, anarchy created by the rugged individualism of the early Renaissance had given way necessarily to absolute rule. Little despots set themselves up in various Italian states, and soon they were copied on a grander scale by national despots in Spain, where Isabella and Ferdinand established absolute rule. In England, where Henry VII ushered in the Tudor despotism by putting the royal crown on his own head after the Battle of Bosworth. In France, where the successors of St. Louis finally brought the various parts of the country under their autocratic sway. These new states capitalized on national differences of language, traditions, and way of life. National feeling, dormant through the Middle Ages, was exploited by the new rulers, and it was found to be a dynamic element that could no longer be ignored by those who would do things in European history. So let's check. Didn't we just hear that he who would understand something would see its origin and growth? So now we're seeing the origin of European nationalism. So I might add, and death. We may be observing that right now. There was relative peace and relative prosperity under these new national despots. People were thankful for the protection given to them by the strong ruler. The middle class, which had been the dynamic group in the social upheaval of the Renaissance, was glad to enter into an alliance with the absolute king in order to make secure the wealth and the position they had recently won. In much of Western Europe, the new social pattern, which was to last until the 18th century, had been cut. The bourgeoisie had sold out their ideal of liberty for the more comfortable commodity of security. But in the Germanies, no such development had taken place. In that section of Europe, there was neither a large middle class with money to pay for security, nor a single ruler with both the ability and the desire to assert absolute control over the German states. The Holy Roman Empire was only a loose organization of jealous princes theoretically under the severely limited control of an emperor. These princes were anxious to assert their complete independence of the emperor and to become petty despots in their respective states. They were predisposed to welcome any disruptive movement that might embarrass the emperor and weaken his already tenuous hold upon them. More important, perhaps, was the lack of a strong king to protect the German people from the onerous exactions of unscrupulous churchmen. Throughout the generation before 1517, bitter complaints were continually made about the tithes sent to Rome and to the various dioceses in Germany. Bitter, too, were the complaints about the lax living of the clergy. Such was the social and economic discontent with church organization in Germany that the papal nuncio complained in 1521 that 9/10 of the people were crying, "Long live Luther," and the other 10th, "Death to the church." There was no discontent, only confusion with church doctrine. but Germans were ready to back any spokesman who would denounce ecclesiastical practices and inveigh against Rome's exactions. This discontent was deepened by the fact that Germany was suffering economically. For some time, a gradual drift of trade routes westward had been shifting prosperity from German and Italian cities to the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. An increase in the amount of bullion caused a general price rise in a day when German income did not increase at all. Particularly, princes whose fixed revenues were pitifully inadequate to meet the higher cost of living found themselves in bad economic straits. They tried every method possible of increasing their incomes, which meant discovering additional ways of squeezing money from their serfs and peasants. All of this made for social unrest. The Germans were restless in 1517. They were seething with social and economic discontent, and the masses of illiterate peasants were ready to grasp at anything which offered the slightest hope of change. Any change, they felt, would have to be for the better. They were a religious people in the Germanies, more so than in Italy or France, but in a mystical and emotional way, and they were discontent. Now we're going to go on to part 2. But it's making me think, like, so Isabel and Ferdinand, they're talking like 1492 when they came over here. And we were always taught that they had this tremendous inflation there because of all the gold they brought back. But I hadn't thought about how it would affect the countries, because inflation has the least impact on the first mover. So you come back with a bag of gold, all the prices do not reflect that new bag of gold. So you get to buy everything. So maybe the Spanish or whomever were going around, sounds like, and with trade routes that there were not like strict trade barriers, buying up everything from the other countries for like tons of gold, and maybe the peasants were hoarding it, or it wasn't enough to actually, they needed more of a source to keep up with the price rises. And then if they didn't have any of that, then maybe they didn't even have enough food. Who knows? So this was the stage on which Luther appeared when he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg on Halloween of 1517. But to evaluate Lutheran theory properly, it is much more important to understand its author than its background. For Luther's doctrine is very much the projection of his personality and a solution of his peculiar individual problems. It was because he was so troubled about his own salvation that he developed the satisfying doctrine of justification by faith alone. This one drives me crazy. This is very not Catholic, but I do believe that you have to have faith. Like, I even struggle with the fact that you have to have faith. Like, I feel like, you can have salvation if you just behave properly, but I guess that's not true. This was his only way of obtaining absolute assurance of salvation. So, like, you just have faith. It's not, your behavior can't impact it. And I can understand the theory. Like, you can't be good, right? The just man sins 7 times, 70 times a day. So what are you going to do? But I think try not to. Try better. Try to offset it with some good stuff. It was for this reason, he frankly tells us, that he denied man freedom of will. Without this doctrine of determinism, he says, I believe I would be constantly tortured by uncertainty and compelled to expunge all my work. My conscience would never enjoy certain ease. If free will were offered to me, I would not accept it at all. Luther's main concern was to formulate a creed that satisfied and ensured his abnormal mentality. That is why it is important to know the man and his strange mind to see something of his personal background. Luther was born of peasant stock in Saxony. His boyhood seems to have been gloomy and joyless, pervaded by an overwhelming fear of death, damnation, and the devil. His parents were unduly severe. My mother flogged me until I bled on account of a single nut, is one of his complaints in later life. There was little sunlight in Luther's boyhood. His father, Hans, however, was industrious and, in a practical way, quite intelligent. Within a few years after Martin's birth in 1483, the Luther family was fairly well fixed financially. Hans, who had risen from his peasant status to that of a petty capitalist owner of a copper mine, decided to send Martin through law, the surest road to social preferment and financial security for a German of base blood in the early 16th century. Martin's youth was that of a typical German peasant, wrapped in melancholy, pervaded by popular local superstitions. But he showed himself to have a good mind, though not a deep one. He did well in his studies, obtaining his bachelor's degree in the minimum time in 1502, and 3 years later ranking second in a class of 17 who received the master's degree. At the University of Erfurt, where he did his work, he was subjected to the modern Occamist philosophy with its useless hair splitting and its barren terminism. Though the new humanist studies were then offered at Erfurt, Luther does not seem to have taken to them seriously. His father had picked Martin out a wife and enrolled him in law school. But all at once, the young man was in an Augustinian monastery preparing to become a priest. What happened in the summer of 1505 illustrates the cardinal point of Lutheranism and of Luther's effect on subsequent generations: the supremacy of emotion over the intellect. This guy seems a little harsh. I'm thinking he's unabashedly speaking from his own perspective, the author. Moved by uncontrollable fear when he was almost killed by lightning on July 2nd, Luther took an oath to become a priest if his life was spared. Thus, he entered the monastery, an undisciplined young man, strong-willed and highly imaginative, capable of sharp reasoning on purely practical matters, but beneath the surface, a simple, emotional peasant lad who was concerned with chiefly one problem, the problem of his own salvation. For more than 10 years, this problem ate at his heart. He wrestled with it continually, but he never felt that he had overcome it. He lived in perpetual fear of eternal damnation, in continual dread of dying. Terror besieged him almost always. His novice master tried to comfort him by telling him to have faith. After he was ordained, his superior, Staupitz, tried to soothe his wretchedness by advising him to put confidence in Christ the Redeemer, who could not have died vainly for man's salvation. From this advice, Luther took a small measure of consolation. Uncertainty remained nonetheless, and Luther still searched for reasonable assurance to heaven. He wanted his reservation assured at once so that he could dismiss the problem of his salvation and turn to other matters. This unhealthy inward bent of his mind upon himself, this concern with himself and his own problems alone, continued to occupy Luther until about 1516 or 1517. His flurry of activity, preaching, caring for fish ponds, teaching, was mainly to escape from himself. By 1517, he had worked out his doctrine of salvation, a foolproof one that took all the burden off his own shoulders and put it all on Christ's. So, yeah, I think this author is Catholic, and most of this book has nothing to do with religious leaders, but he seems like, I don't know if, I imagine if I were Lutheran, I would not think this was a fair representation. It's what? Normative and positive? I think he's going more to the normative here. All right. From St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, Luther evolved his theory that all men's efforts are sinful, that he has no free will, that he is an animal governed either by God or the devil, depending who is in the saddle. Completely depraved animal that man is, he can of himself do nothing to earn salvation. It comes to him only when he puts blind trust in Christ. Pecca fortiter et crede firmius, right? Didn't we see that earlier? That said, be honest or something. Sin hard, sin boldly, and believe more firmly. Seriously? All right, that's not cool. The first part is unimportant. It is the second part that counts. Believe. Luther really means trust, always more firmly and blindly. Do not worry about good works, for man can do nothing of himself to earn salvation. Christ has done it all, but the good man will do good works. Okay, but let's remember that Neill is writing this because of its influence on the modern mind. So let's see if that seems like it has influenced the modern mind. That does actually sound right. This doctrine satisfied, Luther had convinced himself of it and was teaching it in his classes when the momentous indulgence controversy broke on Europe late in 1517. Indulgences as good works in the Catholic system had no place in Luther's doctrine of salvation by trust alone. He therefore rose to attack them. Wisely for his cause, he concentrated on the all too apparent abuses in the preaching of indulgences. But he had composed another set of 97 theses 7 weeks earlier, in which he clearly set forth the essential differences between his teaching and the traditionally accepted teaching of the Catholic Church. In these theses, he asserted, among other things, that man can desire and do only evil, that his will is not free, that the sole disposition for grace is predestination, eternal election by God, that the only good law is the love of God. Luther's theses attracted scant attention at first, for it seemed, after all, this was just another of those monkish squabbles so common in 16th century universities. Before long, however, the theses were printed and circulated widely in monastic circles. Because they attacked such obvious and such annoying abuses in such bold language, they appealed to many good German clergymen, and some not so good. Sides began to form, and for a while it seemed that this would become a quarrel between the Augustinians and the Dominicans. For a few years, indeed, there was reason to believe that Luther did not want to break from Rome, that this was just another healthy difference among theologians, which could be debated and eventually ironed out. Luther himself protested his sincere Catholicity to the Pope. I cast myself at the feet of your holiness with all that I have and all that I am. Quicken, kill, call, recall, approve, reprove, as you will. But neither Luther's peculiar mentality nor the spirit of the German princes and people was conducive to a peaceful settlement. Nor did the Catholic Church's representatives deal as capably as they might have with the new heretic. Luther was indeed pushed from holding a moderate position to an extreme one in defending his original doctrine of salvation by trust alone. His debate with John Eck at Leipzig was typical of both his stubborn pride and his intellectual inconsistency, and of Eck's lack of prudence. Luther had held that a church council was superior to the Pope, for he hoped to appeal to a future council for approval of his teaching. When Eck pointed out that the ecumenical councils had specifically denied this point, Luther came to insist that final authority was in Holy Scripture alone. A strong stubborn streak and an obstinate pride on Luther's part, concomitant with social and spiritual unrest in the Germanies and a bad handling of the crisis in Rome, made this monkish squabble grow into the Protestant revolt. The debate at Leipzig in 1519 focused attention on this relatively obscure heretic. The papal bull of excommunication issued the following year made him a national German figure. Wow. Well, that is the end of part 2 of Luther. And I just did not remember what hot sports opinions this guy had. But hey, I'm sure I'll get some emails. If I can remember, it's better if you're here. I'll read the comments because I don't always remember to go back. So let me read a few comments, see what y'all say. If anyone thinks that was absolutely crazy. Let's see where we are. Okay. All right. We're having some fun here in the chat, which I appreciate. A little Sean Connery reference from Saturday Night Live. That's a good one. Yeah, Harry says, is Neill an RC apologist? It certainly sounds like it. And it does look, now that I'm looking, that the blurbs are from Catholic things. But I read it and I remember, like, the first thing I read was like, that's not right. Like, that safety net and stuff like that is a moral and religious obligation. It's not a state thing, and that seems to be. So I did not consider it that way. But the value to that is this. Back then, 75 years ago, you had some extremely clear-cut moral principles and intellectual integrity, and it was just very objective. And they try to be honest about this stuff. Like you would say, I think this, and this is why, because there's so much history behind it. So when it comes to the religious guys, so who are the religious guys in this? Luther and Calvin. There's probably going to be some of this. So if you guys want to buckle up or skip it or whatever, that's fine. Might as well listen to it. The other stuff, though, I would say I would probably want more of that objective black and white criticism than this guy will probably deliver. So I don't think you'll find that Catholicism in the rest of the book. Trust alone sounds like I believe the propaganda. I mean, I do have a problem with that, and I know people who absolutely, like, think I'm crazy that I think, salvation can be earned. It absolutely cannot be. We don't deserve it. I also know Catholic priests who say we don't deserve it. We're doing our best. We've been given this, like, rigged game, rigged in our favor, but you still have to play it with doing good stuff. Such much. Harry says Melanchthon, I'm not pronouncing it right, I'm sure, was a better representative of Lutheranism. See, now Clint is against Luther too. He says many others prove that Luther and many, many others prove that intelligence and knowledge do not often live together. And this is my last comment of the day. My father-in-law had at one point been a Jesuit novitiate. He and most of his class did not finish. Hard for most smart people to give up and accept dogma. The Franciscans, though, have to do poverty, chastity, and obedience. So my uncle was a Catholic priest, and he slept on the floor. He really struggled with obedience, though. He's the guy who turned me on to Murray Rothbard, which, if you meet a Franciscan today, not gonna like Murray Rothbard. But he did live it, but he couldn't. The obedience was hard for him. He got them to give him permission to, like, be rogue, but still. Clint says faith, obedience, and works are some of the required aspects of the gospel. That's what I think too. So I don't know enough about this stuff to say whether Neill is too harsh on this guy, but the thing has value and he's got a perspective, which sometimes I kind of appreciate. Don't want to be wishy-washy. Take a stand. Lukewarm, I shall spit from my mouth, something like that. You remember that one? Okay, guys, thank you so much. That was super fun. I kind of like that, it's a little controversial. Learn together. I gotta put the headphones back on. All right, guys. Thank you so much. See you next time with the next installment of Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas Neill. This is Monica Perez.